Introducing you to people across North Carolina and around the world who put their Catholic faith into action. This is FaithWorks on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Now, here's your host for FaithWorks, Ellen White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. Our show highlights individuals through God's grace who put their faith into action daily. Amazing people who have an interesting, sometimes overlooked impact on our Catholic faith. On FaithWorks, we share their stories. I'm your host, Ellen White. Welcome to Saints in the Making, where we explore the lives of holy men and women who continue to inspire us on our journey of faith. This month, we're turning our attention to three powerful witnesses in the life of the Church: St. Ambrose, St. John of the Cross, and the celebration of the Holy Family, all of whom we honor in the month of December. From the bold preaching and steady leadership of St. Ambrose to the mystical depth and profound spiritual insight of St. John of the Cross, and the radiant witness of love within the feast of the Holy Family. Each of these celebrations reveals a distinct facet of what it means to live a life rooted in Christ. They show us that holiness is born in courage, forged in prayer, and lived out in the ordinary rhythms of family and community. As we enter this sacred season, let's take a closer look at their stories, the virtues they embodied, and the enduring legacy they offer the Church today. As always, we're joined by our guest, Rob Agnelli, who will help us explore these feasts and figures, not just to reflect on their significance, but to understand how their witness can shape our own pursuit of sanctity. Welcome back, Rob.
It's good to be here.
My gosh, in the conversations we had before we got started, I think this is a very timely discussion. So, all right, so St. Ambrose's feast day is December 7th. And, we hear a lot about St. Ambrose and his connection with St. Augustine. I know we'll get into that. But what aspects of his early life prepared him unexpectedly for church leadership? What would you say about him?
So Ambrose, I think, is one of those figures in history that's probably underappreciated, sort of like St. Albert the Great, who he sort of got overshadowed by the saint who came after him and was formed. But I think the history of the church without St. Ambrose is pretty different. Especially he had some pretty serious gifts, even just in his upbringing. So he was a son of a prefect. He's actually, I think, the first church father who came from like a Christian family. Although he did delay baptism, which was sort of the norm at the time. But his father was a sort of politically powerful prefect in France and in the Western Empire. And his mother was especially pious. Two of his siblings, his sister and his brother, are both canonized saints. And so his father dies when he's at a pretty young age. His mother moves the family to Rome, and there he gets sort of the best education. And then he kind of follows his dad into government. When he's about 30 years old, he's appointed prefect. And he's headquartered in Milan. And at that time, Milan had pretty much eclipsed Rome in political power. In fact, the emperor in the Western Empire spent most of his time in Milan. So again, sort of providentially, God had put this, and formed this man for greatness.
I like to do the reflection. I think I've talked to you about this on air before with Bishop Barron and the various Rosary Mysteries. And in one of the mysteries, he talks about the ego drama versus the theo drama. And when we recognize that this is God's theo drama as opposed to ours, and we're not able to discern the various difficulties that we're encountering, or, like with Ambrose being placed in Milan, and how that was just part of God's plan, how that continuously happens, and we shouldn't fight against that.
Yeah. So
that's just something.
Well, it's the scandal, what they call it, the scandal of the particular, right? That Christ, is the center of history because, God acts in history. And we can easily forget that
The scandal in particular. I love that. All right. So what happened that led him to have this position in the church that was so unexpected?
Yeah, so at the time, the church was sort of in the throes of still of the Arian heresy. It had been condemned probably about 30 or 40, well, maybe about 50 years before Ambrose comes along, but there's still a lot of Arians in the church. And there was an Arian bishop in Milan at the time. And so there's a revolt when that bishop dies between the Catholics and the Arians about who the next bishop will be. And so Ambrose enters the cathedral there and to sort of put down the uprising and calm everyone down. Mm-hmm. And he's talking, and all of a sudden the child cries out, "Ambrose Bishop." Mm-hmm. And, all of them the whole mob sort of joins in saying the same thing. And, again, providentially, the Catholics and the Arians suddenly agree about who they want to be the next bishop. And, very clearly the Arians had misjudged him. I guess they thought that he would kind of come around. But he wanted nothing to do with becoming a bishop. Uh-huh. Kind of runs away because he was a catechumen at the time. He hadn't been baptized yet. But eventually the emperor kind of orders him to come back and be ordained bishop. So he's baptized, ordained bishop. And his only stipulation is that he receives orders from a Catholic bishop. So he sort of lets know from the very beginning that this, he's going to be faithful to the true church. And so from there, he becomes Bishop of Milan. So
what do you mean, getting orders directly from a bishop?
Well, so at the time, the church was probably, if John Henry Newman writes about this, about 2/3 of the hierarchy of the church at the time were Arians, and so finding a faithful Catholic bishop was not easy, and so Ambrose is pretty clear that he's not going to be ordained by just any bishop. He wants a Catholic bishop.
I see.
Someone who's faithful to the church. Okay. And so once, the emperor made sure that was happening, then he sort of let down his objection to being ordained.
And, I just with the tumultuous times that he was living in, and, he takes this position as bishop, what was his impression based on his writings about what he was to do as bishop during that time? What were his reflections? What did he see were the most challenging facets of the church?
Well, the challenging thing, I think, was there's a lot of political turmoil at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's really, that turmoil is spilling over into the church because of Arianism. They had a ton of political clout at the time, and the emperors would normally tolerate it, and some of them, like Valentinian, was sort of in favor of it because it kept the peace. And Ambrose was not afraid to call a heretic, and so that made him unpopular with the Arians. I think even at one point Valentinian had told him to let them use the basilica in Milan for the Arians to worship, and Ambrose was like, no way. And so what he did is he basically took all the Catholics in Milan and had them, I guess we would call it like an Occupy movement. They just simply went into the basilica, filled it up while they were praying, made it impossible for them to use. And so he was not afraid to, witness to the truth, even if it meant, coming under fire politically even.
He was known as a powerful preacher and a teacher. What qualities made him so influential spiritually and intellectually?
Yeah, certainly part of that was just his education. He was educated in Rome in the liberal arts. Mm-hmm. But the other thing too, which we sort of maybe don't grasp as easily, that once he was appointed bishop, he devoted all of his time to studying Scripture. And that actually, I think, was what sort of set him apart. And he had sort of a unique way of understanding the Old Testament. He thought about the centrality of Christ, and he used that as the interpretive key for everything, which makes sense. We should, everything in the Old Testament points to Christ. But he's sort of the first one to do that, where it's like everything he preached about, he would, and that's, ultimately when Augustine meets him, Augustine really, one of the things he struggled with and was the intellectual conversion, was the Old Testament. And so he meets Ambrose, and Ambrose has this deep understanding of how Christ fits into the Old Testament, and he sort of removes that obstacle from Augustine. And so I think that sort of talent, that towering intellect, but then mixed, where, grace perfects nature. And so where, he takes his intellectual gifts and puts them, to the service of understanding Scripture. And even just, one of the things in his Confessions, Augustine talks about when he first met Ambrose, he was watching him and he was reading, and he wasn't reading out loud. And so Augustine was like, what is he doing? And at the time, like, you would read out loud. And Ambrose is the first one not to read out loud, because he found that when he read out loud, people would keep asking him questions. And so he would just go off, try to be by himself and read. But this really struck Augustine, was the way he dove into the Scriptures and first formed himself before he tried to teach other people.
What is that? Steeped in Scripture, steeped in...
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the, Jerome, who's a contemporary of his, like, to be ignorant of Scriptures, to be ignorant of Christ.
Yes,
right?
yes. Yeah. All right. So, and it's well known, too, that he made tremendous contributions to the liturgy and the devotional life of the church. In what ways did he do that, Rob?
So one of the things that he is sort of still known for is Ambrosian chant, which is very similar to Gregorian chant. It's monophonic.
I've never heard of it.
Yes. So he wrote, I think it's about 10 hymns. And he sort of brings some of these hymns from the East, and then introduces them in plain chant, and then brings them into the liturgy. And you don't hear as much of the Ambrosian chant now, because Gregorian chant has sort of surpassed it, but they're very similar.
Oh, okay.
Gregorian chant has a little bit it's a little bit more ordered, but it still has that same sort of, rather than polyphony of voices, or polyphony of sounds, it's just this monophonic sound. But, this goes to just the place of chant in the liturgy, how it elevates the mind to God in a very simple way, right? Because it sort of takes the liturgical text and wraps it in this beautiful melody. So he did that, and then he also composed a lot of prayers. The Te Deum, which is one of the most popular sort of Thanksgiving hymns. He wrote that in Thanksgiving for Augustine's conversion. So at the time, again, it's like almost the prophetic nature of it. He realizes, like, this is a profound moment in the church, and he composes this beautiful prayer that Mozart and Haydn, all of them had, have written, put music to, so that awareness of that just beautiful prayer of Thanksgiving.
That's really interesting that he recognized how awesome Augustine's conversion was, even at that time. Wow, that's quite impressive. Yeah, so the Te Deum, I highly recommend that you look it up and start reciting it, because it's a very powerful prayer. All right. And tell me, I'm curious too about his leadership and courage. We kind of alluded to that a little bit before. He didn't let things stop him. If he felt strongly about speaking truth about something, he did and didn't hold back. How would his approach to leadership and courage speak to the church today? Yeah.
So what is pretty striking about Ambrose is, he had a lot of political sort of clout. Just, being the Bishop of Milan, and, he definitely bumped heads with the emperor numerous times, especially Theodosius. At one point he even... he wouldn't let Theodosius into the church until he did public penance. But the emperor was, always willing to sort of accept the authority of Ambrose. What I think is striking, though, so Ambrose knew this and knew he had sort of that moral authority, but he didn't waste that moral authority. So he used it first because he wanted Theodosius' conversion, but he also didn't use it for anything but, the salvation of souls. And so, very often when there's so many things going on, there's a temptation to, I would call it like wasting moral capital, where you want to try to fix everything. And you can't, right? Like you can't pick every battle. And so when he does this, he knows what's important. And he knows that he has this, this gravitas as bishop. And so he's not interested in any political maneuvering. He's interested in, preaching the gospel and converting souls.
Wasting moral capital. Oh my gosh. Again, I'm writing notes again on little tidbits you're giving me here, Rob. All right. So St. Ambrose, please pray for us. We can really use your leadership ability and your courage and your moral authority. All right. So let's transition now to St. John of the Cross, whose feast day is December 14th, unless there's something else you want to add about St. Ambrose. Okay. And for those who may not know St. John of the Cross well, what formed his early spiritual vision? What do you think?
So he is one of those sort of, maybe, I hate to call it characters because it seems made up, but characters in history who, again, another doctor of the church like Ambrose. So he's born probably sometime in 1542. He's the third son. His father comes from this wealthy family of silk merchants, but falls in love with the wrong woman, in that she's this, she's from a lowly station, and his father leaves everything to marry his mother. So for love, right? And this simple thing has a profound effect on John's way of looking at the world. He understood that love required sacrifice, but he also understood, and this is where I think it's really important that anyone who goes and reads St. John of the Cross not forget this, but that love also has passion to it, right? And so he saw sacrifice and suffering as part of love, but he saw it as a way to translate into a passionate love of Jesus. And so his father dies when he's young. I think John is about 2, and so his mom is sort of forced to move around. And really can't get any help from her husband's family because they had disowned him. So she's a weaver. Eventually she moves to Castile, so John is from Spain. And he works at a school and is apprenticed essentially in exchange for food and lodging. And then this priest notices him and realizes he really doesn't really have an aptitude for any of the things he's apprenticing for. But he has this deep sort of piety, but also compassion. And so he's eventually assigned to this nearby hospital. It's mostly for syphilis patients. And it's here where he really exercises and learns how to be compassionate.
So he came in contact with St. Teresa of Avila at some point. So why don't you talk about how they came together and what that relationship did for their respective religious communities?
So St. Teresa of Avila at the time was trying to sort of reform the Carmelites. And she's starting with the women. So she's about 27 years older than John. So she meets John and, being a wise woman, sort of susses out, okay, this is a man who, has some spiritual greatness in him. In fact, he's, over 25 years younger, and she called him his spiritual father, her spiritual father, right? And he would call her his spiritual daughter, right? So she's reforming the Carmelites and the women, but she needs someone to step in and also to reform the men. And she finds John and another priest to essentially be sort of the impetus of the reform. of the discalced, which is just simply means that they didn't wear shoes. Although that's not all they did, obviously. But anyway, so she gets permission from the superior general to form 2 monasteries for the men. And John sort of just innocent, because he trusts her, innocently goes along with it, not realizing how much like trouble he was sort of setting himself up for. And I think what, ultimately, there's, a long period in which they have this beautiful relationship and but I think what is actually beautiful about their relationship is the way in which they describe the spiritual life. There's a sexual sort of complementarity about it in this harmony that, St. Teresa of Avila, like the typical sort of feminine way for the spiritual life, she says, okay, go deep inside of yourself and you will find God at the center, right? And that's a very, like the interior castle is a very sort of feminine way to look at it, that women tend to like get at truth through experience, right? And then for John, he describes it as having these objective stages. So in a very sort of masculine way. And what he describes is this ongoing separation from the world, right? So men have to, again, because of the way they're wired, they have to separate themselves from the world. Women can go interiorly. And so there's this beauty, at the same time, this, again, 2 doctors of the church talking about the same thing, but they have this beautiful way of looking at it from a feminine perspective and looking at it from a masculine perspective.
Wow. Yes. Oh my gosh. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sort of way to understand the spiritual life. And I think that's why, John really resonates with men and some women will go like, I don't get it. They'll say it seems harsh or... Yes, right. And then the same thing with men. They're like, what do you mean the interior castle? Both saying things that are true, but it's, St. Teresa speaking to women.
Okay. He is known to have obviously endured intense suffering, including imprisonment by his own community. How did this experience influence his spirituality and his writing?
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking before we started about just the grace of obedience, right? So, we talked about already there's this sort of juxtaposition or this at least difficulty in that, they're trying to reform the order. They have permission from a cardinal visitator to do this. And then the cardinal dies, and there's this question on who has authority, the superior general, the cardinal, and John was told to do something by the cardinal. And so he's going to do that. The superior is saying something else. And so his brother Carmelites come and get him because they think he's being disobedient. And, at first they take him, to Medina and they're trying to get him to sort of just stop. They're like, hey, you can be a prior here. You can, and he is literally stuck on the fact that he's obeying what he was told to do. And so, just a different way, different time period, but they're trying to break him so that he can repent and, come back and obey what they think is the rightful authority. And so they just keep upping the ante. He eventually winds up imprisoned in what is essentially like a bathroom. It's this little 6x10 small room. And he's in there for 9 months.
Where is that, Rob? Do you know?
I think it is in... it may be in Medina. Okay. Okay. I don't remember exactly where it is. Okay. But, he's underfed. Yeah, of course. He ends up with dysentery. He's exposed to lice. It's just a terrible experience. But what's and this goes back to just the way he is wired. Like he sees God's allowing of suffering as good for him. And so while he's there, in his head, he's composing these beautiful poems, like Spiritual Canticle. Large part of it comes from his time from sitting there in the dark. And he's in these cramped conditions, and he's totally forgotten while he's in there. Teresa's trying to get him out. She's begging the king to get him go out. And eventually he gets a kinder jailer who agrees to give him a pen and paper, and he starts writing some of these things down and gives him a little bit of time outside. And when he's going outside, he's starting to look around to see how he can get out. Mm-hmm. And how he escapes, is... there's obviously some miraculous part of this thing, but somehow the hinges on the door had become loose. He bumps them. He had tied his sheets together.
I was going to say, wasn't he out the window?
Yeah, he climbed out the window, and he's still, 10 feet from the ground because he had apparently just sort of miscalculated.
And didn't he break something?
No, he didn't.
Okay.
So somehow he made it from, fell, didn't get hurt, and he lands in this, this open area of a convent of nuns, and he has no way to get out. And he's about to give it up, and all of a sudden this dog leads him out. And so he always sort of gave Our Lady credit for, and even just so he goes, and when he escapes, he goes to one of Teresa's convents there in Toledo, which was near there. The brothers immediately go there because they think he's there, and they ask the nun at the door, and she says to him, without lying, it would be a miracle for, a man to be in here. And so they nurse him back to health. But you can see like that this deeply sort of, he didn't waste it. Like he made sure his suffering wasn't wasted, but he also knew that God was at work. And so if you read like the ascent to Mount Carmel, it sounds a lot like his escape. He's like, on a dark night, I went out, kindled in love with yearning. I went out, without being observed, and my house was silent. And so you can see that he's, he's deeply formed by this, but he sees God's hand in it.
Wow. If you're just tuning in, this is Ellen White with FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. And today I'm speaking with Rob Agnelli about the saints and celebrations we honor in December: St. Ambrose, St. John of the Cross, and the Feast of the Holy Family. We're exploring their lives, their virtues, and the lasting impact they continue to have on the church. We are grateful for our show's sponsor, Thales College. Yeah, and I think, there's so much intensity in the midst of our sufferings, Rob, and especially when we unite them with Christ's passion. And I think it was Bishop Sheen that said, there are so many people that are laying in hospitals that it's just wasted graces because they're not doing that. And it sounds like St. John of the Cross had the wherewithal for that.
Yeah.
I want to talk about his work, especially The Dark Night of the Soul, but others. They're famous for being misunderstood. And I want you to kind of dive into that for me a little bit and tell me what he was trying to teach us about the spiritual life in the midst of this.
Yeah, so for John, ultimately, everything is about how God guides us into a deeper friendship with him. And so in order to do that, what John is sort of trying to teach us is that we have to learn how to be both purified, because we're fallen, but also detached, because the things of this world, are really good, but they're not him. And so that's what he sort of lays out in the Dark Night. So he has a sort of split up with the active night and the passive night. He has the night of the dark night of the spirit, and then the dark night of the senses. And so, he says, okay, first your intellect has to be purified, so like St. Teresa of Avila, he's like, start with mental prayer, because you got to learn how to think like God thinks, right? And while you're doing that, we need to be purified in our senses, because we're fallen, and we have this tendency to be attracted to things in a disordered way. And so, the spiritual life for John starts with that active sort of, what feels like us pursuing God, although he's the one pursuing us.
That's such an important reminder.
Yeah. So it starts with, having that active faith, letting it, penetrate and purify our minds, and then also to sort of actively mortify our senses. But then at a certain point, God, more definitively takes over and, in a certain sense, detaches us from the things of the world because they aren't him. And so that would be what, John would describe as the passive night of the senses and the passive night of the spirit. And in this way, essentially what God is trying to do to us is teach us to close our eyes, right? And it's, this is where like what Teresa of Avila is saying, like when you can learn how to close your eyes, which we intuitively do when we pray anyway, but you can learn to close your eyes and begin to look inside, you realize that God is closer to you than maybe you are even to yourself. And so, it's mostly just about how, God reminds us that there's all these things, and while they may be signs pointing to him, they are not him. And so he wants us to attach to him.
And the night prepares the soul for deeper intimacy with God.
Absolutely.
I love that. All right, let's do one final question with St. John of the Cross, and then we'll move on to the Holy Family. What practical lessons can we take from his humility, detachment, and deep trust in God's transforming love?
Yeah, so on his deathbed, they came and recited the prayers for the dead for him, and he asked them to stop. And he said, I just want to hear a song of songs. And so I think it's this, that active capacity to see himself as somebody who God is pursuing, right? And that's the reason why I think that's important, right, is because we can get in the habit of thinking, like, I've got to do this, I've got to get to God, I've got to get to God. And it's actually, he's the hound of heaven, right? So, and the reason why that's important is because when we pursue God in that way, and we forget he's pursuing us, we forget that he's going to give us the thing we most long for, right? Like, he is what we really long for. And so I think that, John grasped that, and that's like at the heart of his message. And that's why, the Song of Songs is exactly about that. It's like, God's pursuit of the soul.
And our conscience too. I find, Rob, with me personally, that when I feel like oh my gosh, I've got all these things that I need to do. I need to pray this prayer. I need to do this in Mass. And I just know I don't. I'm just going to sit and be quiet and be present to the Lord.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's like, especially in Mass, right? Like, there's a beautiful, like, God the Father sent Christ to you in the Mass. Like, from all eternity, God said, I want Ellen. And Jesus said, okay, I'll go get her. And every time you go to the Mass, that's what he's doing. He's coming to get you. And so if you can remember that, it changes changes the whole way you approach, even just like praying through the Mass, right? When you realize that actually Jesus is pursuing you, rather than, you going, oh, like it was a pain to get the Mass today or whatever. It's like, no, he brought you here.
He is pursuing me. All right. Wow. That's a great reflection. Okay. Holy Family. Feast day is December 28th. Why does the church devote a feast to the Holy Family, and what does it invite us to reflect on? Well, I think there's a lot.
Yeah. So the feast is actually, in timing of the church, is pretty new. It was, I think, in 1893, Pope Leo the 13th instituted it, and then I think it was Pope Benedict the 15th in like 1920 or 1921 made it a universal feast day. And I think that's not without accident, because if you think about the revolutions of the 19th, early 20th century, all the way up to our own day, right? The Industrial Revolution, the Marxist Revolution, Sexual Revolution, every one of those things is an attack on the family.
Yes.
And Pope Leo the 13th really sort of grasped that, I think. Like, if you read his writings, you can tell that he saw all of those as coming at the family. And so I think it's an important reminder, that we need the grace to protect the domestic church, because it is clearly under attack.
Yes.
From every ideology and from every angle.
From every angle. Well, and I want to reflect too on, I have a beautiful icon in our bedroom of the Holy Family, and I love it. The color is just incredible, and Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus and the way they're positioned. It's such a great daily reminder for me. But a lot of their early life together is hidden. There's not much that we know. Why is that spiritually important, do you think?
Well, I think just from a natural level of understanding the way God works and the world works, most of what we do is hidden from everybody but us and God. Right. And the ordinary everyday, like that moment you spend in the morning, like reflecting on that, no one will, like, if you hadn't told me, I would have never known. No one would ever know about it. It's just you and God. Right? And so, it goes to the bigger issue of, like, why does Christ do anything? It's so that he can sanctify it. Right. And so why does Christ have a family? So that he can sanctify every aspect of a family life. Right. So I can draw from the graces of the Holy Family, because that's why Christ did it. And so I think just the hiddenness is the fact that, God sees everything and Christ sanctified everything. And so, if we just let, Nazareth be like a school for us of how to live, and then know that there's power there because Christ was there, to grow in the virtues that are necessary for family life, but also to just grow in holiness.
Well, how do they model that, though, and how can we replicate it?
Yeah, so it's not like that's the part that you almost have to sort of just understand. Like, this is where the sacrament of marriage is so important, right? Because like all of the graces of Nazareth like flow through the sacrament of marriage. And I think it's, Paul VI has a beautiful reflection when he visited Nazareth. I think it was in 1964. And he gave a homily when he was there, and he calls it the school of the gospel. And it's because if I were to sort of summarize it, I would definitely say go read it, especially like it's a great reflection. I think it may even be in the Office of Readings for the Feast of the Holy Family. But what he says is, it's like, what's the purpose of the family? It's like the family is where we learn how to love, right? And if we, if we look to Nazareth, we learn how to love like God intended the family to love, right? So Joseph, who is this image of God the Father who leads his family, like Mary with this, perfect purity and perfect maternity, and Jesus, the obedient son, who works with his father, and just this beautiful like reflection on family life. And it's sort of an easy way for us to be schooled in what God's intention for the family was.
Great for a reflection, Paul VI. Okay, I'm definitely going to be looking that up. And you mentioned the graces that we receive in marriage from the sacrament of matrimony. And I think it's important to mention too, Rob, that you have to call on those graces. You can't, they don't just come through osmosis.
Well, and a lot of it is just being aware of, like, I think this is, this totally get us down a rabbit hole, but I don't feel like most people realize that on your wedding day, like God put himself on the hook for every grace you need for marriage to sanctify you and your spouse, right? So in a certain sense, he owes them to you. And so I think it's not even just like, yes, like we in a certain sense need to call upon them, but I don't even know that a lot of times we're conscious that they're just there. Like, they're ready for it, like, they're ready for us to take. So
they're ready for us to take, but how do we receive them?
Yeah, well, I think that's where the Holy Family is so important, is because, yes, like in order to be sort of moved by grace, I have to be aware that it's a reality, right? Mm-hmm. And I have to come to expect that God is going to check this, to deliver. And I think that's the key, is to sort of, and that's why I think, again, going back to the Holy Family is so important, because we know it's, that shows what grace does. Right, and shows how possible it is. Like Mary and Joseph are human beings, right? Who like show the power of grace to completely and totally transform not just individuals, but families and married couples.
And you talked about Joseph and Mary, and Joseph is known to have a sort of quiet strength, and Mary, her contemplative heart. What can we learn from that, and how can we emulate that?
Yeah, I think going back to your question, like in both those cases, like you're talking about like this sort of silence, right? This interior sort of silence, and especially like today, where I think families are almost crushed by like a dictatorship of noise around them, right? And so silence becomes this valuable commodity. And what I think is important is we forget that it's not just the absence of noise, right? Like silence is really an act of listening, where I'm listening to hear the voice of God. And that goes back to your question about like, how do I know like the graces, right? Well, like I ask for them, right? And I expect God to speak and to do something.
You talked about how silence is a valuable commodity too, Rob. And I think that I would always ask the question of God, well, I want to do something. I want to help the church. I want to do what I'm called to do. What is my calling? And I felt like it had to be some sort of monumental thing. And it seems like in this day and age, we don't have to do a lot to be countercultural and respond in the way we're called to. I mean, it's like with the silence thing and not doom scrolling or being present to others in relationship. These are very easy things that we can do.
Just being present to God in prayer, like committing every morning to 20, 30 minutes of being present to God in prayer.
Let's switch gears just a little bit and think about how, when we contemplate the Holy Family, how does that deepen our appreciation for the incarnation itself? What do you think?
So I think in all of these things, the Holy Family, Nazareth, makes the incarnation real. Right. So it makes it. And this is why I think it remains a little bit hidden. We're always looking for ways to relate to Jesus, right? And what's more relatable than family life? And so I think it helps us to not turn the incarnation into some distant, unreal event,
right?
But something that happened in history,
right, that
still has its effects here and now on me, and all I need to do is just put myself in contact with it.
And the innocence of a child, we could spend a lot of time reflecting on that and talking about the baby Jesus. I had a dear friend that I was sitting with one time, and we were talking about the nativity, and she started crying, and she said, just the fact that Christ came as a baby, and he's such an innocent baby, it's so disarming in the context of the family too. It's so humble, obedient, all of these virtues that we've been talking about here today. All right. What spiritual practices can help families imitate the virtues of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in daily life, Rob, as we wrap up?
It's funny because I was thinking about St. Teresa of Avila had this habit that she used to tell the sisters, where she would tell them, like when something was going on in their life, to map it to Christ's life.
Oh, that's interesting.
So something going on, like a suffering, for example, right? So she would, you have a headache, like map it to maybe the crown of thorns sitting on, because there's a power there, right? There's a power.
So kind of like attaching.
Yeah, because
attaching.
Well,
okay.
because when Christ was suffering, that he had you in mind, right? And so he's suffering for you, and at the heart of it, that's like when we talk about uniting your sufferings with Christ. That's what you're really. It's not you doing it again. It's you sort of. He's already thought of it. He's already done it, right? But you don't just have to do that with bad things. Right, you can do that with good things, and so I think it's a fruitful sort of spiritual practice to map yourself to just the normal things that Christ did in family life, because that's how they're sanctified, because He did them first, right? So just family meals, right? Like just pray through them sitting down to a meal together and know that like Christ has sanctified every family meal because He participated in them, and every family meal that you recall that, He's already thought of it. He thought of it 2,000 years ago and has supercharged it with grace. And so Teresa of Avila, that's what she means. That's, and that's where you get the idea with, where St. Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He's drawing grace from Christ's actions are still affecting him here and now. And, for most of us, we're not going to get stuck up on a cross. But are we going to, have to go through difficulties in preparing the family meal? Yes. Is that sanctified? Yes.
It's such an important reminder too, that we need to be present to the here and now, because, obviously Christ is now and His graces are present now. It helps us to be grounded in our relationship with Him and to recognize His presence with us. I don't know. Any final thoughts as we look back on St. Ambrose, St. John of the Cross, and the Holy Family, Rob?
Back in just the truth of the reality of Christ touching your life now. Right. That is going on. He's not far away. He is acting here and now because He acted then. And He acts for all eternity.
Another good one. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Rob. All right, as we wrap up today's episode of Saints in the Making, we've seen how God works through very different lives. A bold bishop, a contemplative mystic, and a humble family in Nazareth to build his church and draw us closer to himself. St. Ambrose reminds us to speak truth with courage and to lead with wisdom, especially when the church faces confusion or challenge. St. John of the Cross invites us into the deeper places of prayer, teaching us that even in darkness, God is at work transforming our souls. Wow. And the Feast of the Holy Family shows us that holiness begins at home in patience, sacrificial love, and fidelity to God's will. So here's our challenge for the week, and I'm taking it on myself too. Choose one small act that reflects the virtues we've seen today, a moment of courage, a moment of deeper prayer, or a moment of love within your family or community. Maybe it's standing firm in truth with gentleness, setting aside quiet time to be with God, or offering forgiveness and tenderness to those closest to you. The saints and the Holy Family didn't set out to be extraordinary. They set out to be faithful, and so can we. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on past conversations filled with inspiration and hope, you can find them all at divinemercyradio.org. Just click on local shows. And don't forget, you can take FaithWorks with you wherever you go. Just download the free Divine Mercy Radio app from your app store. Simply search Divine Mercy Radio and see, and you're all set to listen anytime, anywhere. God bless.